For the last 37 of this planet's solar rotations, there has been peace. Peace thankfully brought by the swarm that we know as humans, defeating the swarm of insectoids. Their true name is one that is almost impossible to pronounce by anyone other than themselves. Even those that are a strange chimera amalgamation of human and insectoid have trouble pronouncing it. However, thanks to what the humans have done, peace has come, and we have not lost a single species since then. Everyone is grateful for this. Everyone is also grateful for the updates that they have received from humanity. More human engineers have entered into our space, working on our own engines, making our FTL engines even better than they were before. We shudder sometimes to think what the humans could possibly have in their back pockets. Something hidden from us. What technologies might they have if they're this good at dealing with ours? However, we do not worry about this too much, as we realize that all the benefits far outweigh any of the dangers that might come with it. Though we are always suspicious, we worry about these humans, as they are working very closely with the new insectoid amalgamations, though there are no more being created, at least none that are welcome within human society. It is not uncommon to see a new one that is very strange. They're always slightly different, and we don't understand why. Some of them have multiple legs and no wings. Others have wings, but they're bipedal. Some seem to have multiple arms, wings, and two legs. It is absolutely amazing. But each of them seems to be genetically engineered specifically for visual purposes, to be more aesthetically pleasing to the humans themselves. It is though the insectoids are trying to placate the humans. We don't mind this, as this brings more peace. The insectoids have even shared some of their own bioorganic technology, which is something far beyond our understanding, yet the humans seem to simply sit and study it. It is strange. It is always worrisome when a human gets very quiet. When a human is focusing very closely at what they're seeing, trying to figure out how it works, their brains working, as they say, in reverse, trying to break everything down to its base parts and rebuild it again in their mind over and over and over again to see what is the way it functions, what it's made out of, how everything operates so that they could make it stronger, faster, better than it was before. Many people worried about this as they realized that the humans and their former foes were getting very close, and in a few cases it was obvious to see they were getting very close. It was always a human female shaped form that was coming in, and they were always close to the humans call them what they officers, yes. They always were close to that. They almost never went with the enlisted personnel, as they called them. It was strange. It was though they were always trying to hang around the ones that had most shiny uniforms on. Yet this was kind of a contradiction, since we looked at those who were, as they put, enlisted, and many of them had many, many more medals, ribbons, and awards on them than any officer did. The only thing the officers did was have a very colorful display on their chest. The others called it a fruit salad. However, it's not something they ate, so we were confused at this. Yet they always seemed to laugh when they said this. We still don't understand human humor, as it were, as they will laugh and chuckle at some of the strangest things, even some of the noises that these chimeras will make. And it was very, very common to see one of these chimeras holding on to the arm of one of the humans, seemingly getting as close as possible. Many of the chimeras, as they came out, were less and less soft. The insectoid race asked desperately for more human DNA to see if they could integrate more of the human genome into their own descendants. This took many years, and only recently have the humans agreed to do so. They sent small parts, packets of blood, a couple of organs, that sort of thing. They never sent an entire cadaver or an entire human being into the territory. The insectoids were still looked at cautiously, as they had torn apart entire sectors of space in their rampage across entire species as they consumed everything within their path. This made many of the other species cut them a wide berth as they walked by, yet many of the chimeras seemed to look with a little bit of concern, almost care in their eyes. They seemed to look more and more human as time went on once the Queen got a hold of more human DNA. It seemed as though the humans gave the best DNA, as the next ones that we saw, though not in large quantities, were much more aesthetically pleasing, pushing certain proportions to almost comical degrees by even human standards. It was something to notice. And many folks sat and enjoyed their favorite type of drink as they joked at the idea of chimeras turning more and more and more human as time went on. And eventually, you would see more and more of them start going into human population centers, though humans kept their own sector off limits. Anything outside of their original sector was free for trade and travel, and it was very common to see several of these insectoids trying to sell, well, for lack of a better term, themselves to any human who might be there. Many personnel believed that this was their way of collecting DNA, and this made many of those cautious. However, it was clear that many of the humans were more than willing to, shall we say, indulge in the possibilities. In several cases, it got to the point that you would actually see couples, and to our absolute shock in the past few planetary rotations, we were amazed to see something we didn't think possible. A few of these had actually given birth to children that were sired by humans. These offspring were almost human-like, though there was clear insectoid in them. Sometimes it was just some antennae, other times it was wings, other times it was the way their joints were twisted. It was just something else to see. In one case, it was a simple small male that had, instead of the standard 5 digits, it was three in an insectoid type of claw, though it didn't seem to have any problems. The rest of it, aside from the hands, were completely human from the look of it. And from the look of the mother's face, you would think that she was taking the best of care as the same as any other human. It was definitely something worth seeing. This was one of the few things that put everyone at ease. It even seemed to put the humans at ease, as we noticed many of their own warships were pulling further and further away from the insectoid homeworld. They left them alone to their own devices. They believed that peace had been achieved, and they could finally relax and work on their own cultures, bringing themselves up to new heights, all raising other species up at the same time. It was glorious, but it was a dream. We all remember the day it happened. The council members were just going through their regular routine, looking over new, more diplomatic ways of doing things, trying to streamline all these, when all of a sudden, all the insectoids in the room started convulsing, many of them holding onto their heads and moving around sporadically. They started kicking over chairs and desks and jumping up. Some of them, if they had wings, would start to hover and then drop down, looking like they were in severe pain. Those that could climb walls did, as they thrashed around, seemingly holding on to their heads. Not knowing what was going on, everyone started screaming for medical personnel. And within 2 minutes, we understood why they were doing this. The screams, the absolute horrific screams that echoed down the halls and made every species cringe at the sheer volume and the sheer frequency of what was coming across. It was like metal being ripped across a chalkboard with nails and broken glass being shoved in your ear at the same time. It was absolutely horrid, and everyone covered their ears to include the humans themselves. And then every insectoid started screaming, "She's calling! She's calling! She's coming!" And that, for many of them that we saw, that was the last thing they said, where they seemed to have their own personality. They all of a sudden just stopped. More than half of them just froze there. Others still thrashing around, desperately trying to fight whatever was going on. One of them hovered down towards the human that it had mated with, and the human grabbed a hold of her and wrapped his arms around her, seemingly trying to comfort her as she screamed in his ear. We could see that this must have been painful, as that ear started to bleed uncontrollably. As drops of blood started falling out, he held her tighter and tighter, trying desperately to calm her down. The other insectoids seemed to be frozen in place. Every light of individuality was out of their eyes, and in a sudden flash, they all jumped at whatever was not insectoid and started thrashing, spitting any type of venom if they had any. They would come down with stingers if they had them and started ripping them apart. Every single person started running, reaching for security. The security came in and tried to blast them with the pulse weapons, but the pulse weapons seemed to not work. That was strange. They seemed to work on insectoids, but these were not just insectoids anymore. These were chimeras. They were able to take the hits, and they continued to run at all of the security. The last thing on anyone's video screen in the council chamber was the one human holding on to his insectoid mate as she continued to cry in pain, seemingly trying to fight off whatever was happening. But another insectoid came up behind them and jabbed her appendage clean through the torso of both, and they died holding onto each other. This visual was something that was shown across the entire known universe. And as this went across and everyone realized something was off, something was wrong, the insectoid swarm had rebuilt itself and was now coming across sector by sector, hitting every perimeter of its own territory at the same time. They spread across like a sheer wave, a flood, if you will, taking over entire planets in days. If they had even a colony, it would only take an hour before they were completely overrun, stripped clean, torn apart. Every piece of flora and fauna would be used as biomaterial for the swarm itself. They began to build their massive hives on there as well. New queens for the planet were spawned immediately, and they reached out beyond. Everyone shuddered in fear at this. Everyone was afraid of the swarm. Everyone armed their ships. Everyone got in defensive position. Everyone checked their weapons, and everyone got ready for the onslaught. Except for humans. The humans were on the other side of the universe itself. They would not be touched by the swarm. And no matter how many species cried out, desperately asking for humanity to bring its fleet into the fray, they stood fast, and they waited. We did not know what was going on, nor did we care. The humans, we needed them. We needed the swarm of the humans to fight this swarm. Once again, we needed an unstoppable force to hit this immovable object. Or did we get it backwards? It didn't matter. The swarm was coming, and we now had better weapons this time. However, we didn't know if we could stop them. By the time it reached the first homeworld closest to the swarm itself, many of the swarm had been stopped dead in its tracks, but they knew this wouldn't hold. Just as before, the war of attrition was coming across, and the swarm itself, every time it took a planet, would first build a hive, and then start building ships, and spawning as many warriors if they could. These warriors were more deadly than before, mixing all sorts of DNA. Most of them were ubiquitous, still running around on 6 legs and looking very much like giant bugs. However, these were now thinking bugs, and they were not so easily squished and stepped on, but instead they would be able to duck and dodge and then strike before you knew what happened. The Keltipsians were the first ones to ever learn this. They would see their own fleet be outflanked by the insectoids as they had set up a battle line to stop the insectoid fleet. And at first, it worked. It stopped them butt cold right where they were. The insectoids could barely come out at FTL speeds without being torn asunder by the Keltipsian fleet. And yet, before they realized it, the swarm had enveloped the entire sector and was now jumping in from all different areas at the same time. The Keltipsian fleet tried its best, but it had itself too thin. It had to spread out around its home planet and use its own orbital defense satellites in a desperate attempt to stop the swarm from entering their planet. Once they got on the planet, they realized they were definitely not large enough to fight these new warriors. There was nothing they could do, and they screamed out into the darkness, "Save us!" And they got a response back as they called out, "Save us." They received were already there. By the time this message even got to the Keltipsian High Command, a huge armada of newly refit human ships came into the sector and started launching their own swarm. This swarm was even more devastating than before, each of them having their own energy weapons with ballistic weapons and the ability to tear into the swarm itself with huge mechanical claws. It was like they built their own insectoid fleet and they began to tear into each other with reckless abandonment. Though we could not hear the insectoids scream in space, we knew they did as they thrashed about as they were vented out into the atmosphere. The ships from the human main fleet started tearing into the flagships of the insectoids with, again, reckless abandonment. The Keltipsian fleet couldn't really do much. Their weapons could not reach out as far as the humans could. Yet the human captains did not care. They simply positioned themselves between the insectoid fleets and the Keltipsian defense forces, and they used themselves as human shields to stop any advancement. As many of the insectoids kamikaze towards the planet, trying desperately to get their own type of breaching pods onto the ground, many of them crashing into the human ships. Even though point defense systems would shoot many of them, there's only so many the point defenses can hit at once. With this, the fight went inside the ships as warrior insectoids came through the hallways. Though a little large for the hallways themselves, they did seem to manage, but inside, everyone thought that humanity wouldn't be able to fight hand to hand with them. They realized that without the major suits, they wouldn't be able to hold up against these new warriors. They were wrong. A video was shown of those from inside the bridge reaching under their own consoles, picking up their own weapons, loading them, and then looking at the door. And as the insectoids tried to breach in, they were met with a wall of all sorts of energy and ballistic fire. Their own warriors were torn to ribbons as they tried to force their way through, almost reckless, almost suicidal as they went in, and they all fell to the point where they had to try and push their own brethren aside to get through, but as they did, they opened themselves up, and it seemed as though the humans were laughing, enjoying this, and actually placing bets on who could nail a headshot as they tried to push their way through. The insectoids didn't realize this and still tried to take the bridge. The same thing played out inside the engineering bay, but we knew from experience never underestimate a human engineer. They used their own fluid from the old fusion drives and turned the hallways into a massive, massive plasma conduit where everything was scorched down to atoms. And before they even realized it, the flames had reached halfway down the ship and had blown all the way through to where the breach was, burning away any insectoids in its way. They had to worry that they might have shot past the bulkheads towards the bridge, but the bulkheads would immediately shut to make sure that the insectoids didn't get farther. Wherever the insectoids were at that point, they were not anymore. The human ships stood tall and proud. Though beaten, they were able to fight down and keep the Keltipsian from losing their homeworld. And with this, the insectoids seemed to shudder. Everyone wondered why the humans took so long to bring themselves into this fight, but they received a strange message. It was a message from one of the insectoids. One of the chimeras, that was on Earth. Somehow, they had figured out how the Queen was able to control them, and they were able to stop her. With this, the chimera pleaded with everyone to try and not and kill her kin. The chimeras don't know what they're doing. They need to be just held, imprisoned, until the Queen is dealt with. And once the Queen is taken care of, then you can punish them if you wish, but they are not at fault, as their bodies are not theirs to control at this point. At that point, she also showed the video of the one that fought off the control inside the council chambers in the arms of her lover until they were both killed, neither one giving up on each other. It was only with this explanation and video that everyone knew that the Queen was the one to blame and she was the primary target. They didn't have to wonder what the humans were going to do, as the primary fleet of humanity started going straight towards the insectoid home planet. They all wondered how humanity could have so many fleets, and yet found out very quickly that all human ships are armed. Humans are very paranoid, especially when it comes to bugs. Yet they did have a fatal flaw when it came to warfare, and that is they did not want to hurt the innocent. This meant that they did not have a choice. They would have to make this personal. And when everyone heard this, they wanted to understand how this couldn't be personal. One of the human captains simply stated, "We're professionals. Professionals can't make things personal or you make stupid decisions. But now they've fucked with our families. You made it personal. And we don't forgive those who make it personal." No species quite understood what they were talking about, yet they sat and watched as the human fleets bulldozed right into the insectoid swarms, not seeming to care about the damage that they were taking, as many of the breaching pods would crash into the ships, but instead of letting out soldiers, they would simply explode. They were using the pods as missiles, and yet they would fire so many. It seemed as though the humans had a limit on how much of their own ordnance they could fire out, and it seemed as though closer to the home planet they were running low. This was the one key flaw that the insectoids had figured out. They realized that if you run the humans out of ammunition, then they don't have much else. At least, that's what they thought. Humanity's main fleet reached the insectoid homeworld, bypassing many worlds, not even seeming to care about the defense fleets around those worlds, even though those defense fleets would eventually break off and try to flank the humans, but then they couldn't because they realized that every single human battle group and fleet was heading in their direction. As the human dreadnoughts dropped in above the surface, many of them seemed to not fire. It was strange. We watched in amazement as they told the Queen to stand down and await judgment. The Queen simply responded after the translator did its thing. "You do not dictate to me. You are food, nothing else. You are less. You are nothing. You do not command me. I control all." With that, the humans simply stated, "Well, I guess no negotiation with terrorists." And with that, they fired off a whole bunch of ordnance, taking down any ship that was still in the atmosphere. And then they sent several other ships close to the surface. And then we watched as the swarm came out of the belly of all the ships. All these drop pods came down, along with shuttles, fighters, small corvettes. Everything was flying towards the surface. Yet they didn't glass the surface. They all landed with a thud, of course, usually taking out several insectoids in the process, and yet they began to just take out as many as possible, heading straight towards the caverns. The queen must have realized what was going on, as the caverns seemed to start collapsing on themselves just as the humans started to breach inward. She seemed to be hiding behind them. But the humans had an ace up their sleeve. The corvettes were bringing all sorts of digging material, and before they realized it, a massive drill on legs was being constructed. Many people wondered what kind of crazy human would even think up something like this. And when they asked the humans, they said, "Oh, we saw it in a movie once." Many people were afraid of this. Most people had seen human cinema at this point, yet most could not understand it or could stomach it. In fact, the moment they found out that something called Rule 34 was banned by most governments, they stayed away from human media. However, some movies did make it out, which made a few species laugh at the idea of what they're seeing. Before they knew what was going on, many of these drills started to go inside the planet, heading straight towards the chamber that holds the queen. The queen was scared. She must have been, because many of even the workers, those that did not have the ability to fight, were sent in as cannon fodder to try and stop the humans. The humans simply brought out their heated blades and started slashing apart those workers. The workers couldn't get through the suits, which were now seemingly partially organic. It was as though now an insectoid was going to fight an insectoid. We didn't understand. We watched in amazement as the humans sunk down into the queen's chamber. And as they did, they looked on in horror as hundreds of thousands of humanoid insectoids were there. All of them crowded around the queen. She was controlling them, waving all 20 of her antennae around, controlling them to make sure that they surrounded her in a type of human shield. And everyone was absolutely stunned. With this, a single human stepped forward and gave a command. "I got this, bitch." With that, one of them handed him a very, very large weapon, which he hoisted up and seemed to be aiming it at the insectoid queen's head. With that, the insectoid queen seemed to pick up a few of these seemingly female amalgamations and held it in front of her. He simply said, "Let them go, you bitch!" as he fired and severed one of the antennae clean off. With that, the queen seemed to screech, and with that she lost control of the humanoid ones in her hand, exposing her face. The next shot went right through the top of her face, then another one just below that, then another one just below that. The sound was so much that the microphones just would not be able to keep up with it. And with that, the queen started to thrash. Then a few came up with a larger piece of munitions, hoisted up on their shoulder, and fired, and with that the queen's head exploded in seemingly a massive fireball that seemed to burn with unceasing ferocity. Everyone was surprised at this, and as they watched, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The humans laughed and said something about nothing as good as napalm and white phosphorus. And one just yelled out, "Willie P, motherfucker, Willie P!" We were just stunned at the sheer violence, brutality, and yet the nonchalance of the humans. But then everything shifted. The chimeras started to come into their own thoughts. And they started screeching and screaming, but not in pain, but in fear. They had never known individuality before. Many of them had just hatched not even too long ago. Some of them were so small that they could be considered as infants. And with that, humanity suddenly changed. They were amazed at what had happened. Though a few of the planets still had their own planetary queens, which would be dealt with very soon, almost all those outside of that one planet, or within its own lunar orbit, which is as far as they had ability to control, being that they were young queens, everyone else was free. In a single moment, everyone saw the imprisoned chimeras thrashing around as the queen was struck, almost as though they were trying to fight an invisible enemy inside their cells, and then all of a sudden they all just stopped, as though they came to their senses all at the same time. With that, most of them dropped to their knees and started screeching. They were now in mental anguish as they were realizing what they had done. What they know is that their bodies were not in their own control. It was like being part of a three-dimensional roller coaster video game where they could feel everything. They saw everything, but they could do nothing. And yet, humanity did not end them all right there. Instead, they sent their own ships over, their own medical teams, to go in and make sure that these new chimeras were not injured. We didn't understand this. None of the council ever understood any of this. Why didn't humanity just wipe them out off the face of the planet? And one of the humans at that point screamed at one of the command inside his own bridge. He grabbed the young Xeno, raised him up, and said, "No women, no kids, asshole," and tossed the Xeno off to the side, seemingly showing the sheer anger that humans can have. It was astounding once we all got to see all the video that came from there. Many of it took weeks before we saw it all. Humanity had somehow created a new species, surely by accident, but it was a strange species. This species was entirely female. There was no males. There was no drones. The drones that had been attached to the queen simply stopped. They weren't going to move. They were pure insectoid, and now, without the queen, they didn't have a will, period. It was something about being human that gave them the strong will to survive, the chimeras did. And yet the others simply stood in place until they either starved or died of dehydration. It was a horrible way to go, but at least they had no idea what was going on. Humanity gathered up as many of these chimeras as possible and sectioned off a new portion of space so that they could make their own way in the universe itself. They were able to find a couple suitable planets that were right next to each other in the same sector. It was something that no one expected. A species that was so angry, so violent, that they had cut through entire fleets without even slowing down and showing how vicious they can truly be, was now being so careful and so kind. With that, many never would visit this sector. Never. They were too afraid. Yet humanity would visit often. Many humans would turn out to find these places to be a good place to retire, or a nice place to visit. Many of these chimeras started to build their own resorts, and decided that, well, they would use their best assets to bring in any type of vacationer. And it turned out they wanted to make their own way. Humanity was fine by this. But they always did keep those chimeras at arm's length now. Very few would actually get in solid relationships with them. Why? Well, everyone worried about the emergence of a new queen. For if that happened ever again, well, these chimeras, since they were originally meant to be bioweapons, might turn against humans again. And if that does happen, we all understand that humanity would not hesitate to end them all. And by their request, the chimeras do still have a seat in the Galactic Council, but they're always right next to the humans. And when asked why, the humans simply stated, "There's an old phrase we go by." Everyone responded with, "No kidding, you go by a lot of old phrases, what's this one?" The human would always chuckle and say, "Keep your friends close and your enemies much closer."